Telemundo, a whole slew of cable networks, many of which will be familiar to you. International channels. So this is who owns the NBC network, for the most part. And huge involvement in banking, in insurance, in defense industries, in consumer appliances. There is a point to all of this, so bear with me. I'm just laying out for you this basic deal. Now, Goofy, Donald Duck, that cute little Walt Disney Corporation is also one of the 6 major players in really international media. 36.1 billion in product. They own ABC Television, cable networks including ESPN, Disney Channel, Soap, A&E, Lifetime, 277 radio stations covering about 1/4 of the United States, music and book publishing companies, Touchstone, Miramax, and Walt Disney Pictures. Huge, huge player in the commercial film industry. They're a big player in radio. They're a big player in publishing. Family Fun, ESPN Magazine, Jetix, Wonder Time Magazine, Bassmaster, and Disney Adventures. Music groups, huge holdings in the music industry. And serious holdings in book publishing. Hyperion Books, Disney Press, Hyperion Books for Children. And so it goes. These are major publishing companies. Online holdings, as for all of these, are considerable. Extensive holdings in Europe, Latin America, Asia. Publishing. Excuse me a minute here. Barron's, Smart Money, Big League, Inside Out. In newspapers, they now own arguably the 2nd flagship newspaper in the United States, the Wall Street Journal, something Murdoch wanted for years. They also own the New York Post, which is a major New York paper. They own a slew of television and radio stations across the United States and internationally. I'm sure you've all been aware of Rupert's little problems in Europe regarding hacking into cell phones and the closing of one of the major tabloids in Britain. Again, this is an extremely large corporation spanning the globe. Among books, HarperCollins Publishers, another major book publisher. Time Warner. We all know about Time Warner. Briefly, AOL Time Warner. That was a marriage that didn't take at all. 25.8 billion in revenues. And it is the largest media conglomerate in the world. Among the things that they own, of course, would be CNN. CNN started out as just a down-home little venture by Ted Turner. And he, metaphorically speaking, crawled into bed with Warner Brothers Pictures, and created what has become the largest entertainment conglomerate in the world. In fact, the largest media conglomerate. Their holdings are extensive, and the implications are also extensive. If you consider the impact of CNN internationally, the ownership of that should be of some concern. Viacom is a very interesting case in point, because at one point, about 9 years ago, Viacom bought CBS, which is another player here. It was a bad marriage for many reasons, and on paper anyway, Viacom and CBS got divorced. So their holdings at this point would be MTV, Nickelodeon, Nick at Night, a lot of these you would perhaps recognize. Paramount Pictures is really important. Paramount Home Entertainment, music and game developing. Viacom 18 is a joint venture with Indian media companies. So again, this is another company with international reach. Other holdings of Viacom would be MTV Mobile, MTV Games, BET Mobile, Harmonix, Youth Media and Marketing, etc. Now we come to maybe the most venerable of the United States television networks, CBS. 13 billion revenues. They own the CBS network. They own CW, they're in a joint venture with Time Warner. Showtime, book publisher Simon & Schuster, which is a huge publishing company. And is now the leading supplier of videos to Google. Other holdings on CBS, and they might be listed here and they're not. CBS, as does NBC, also have holdings in the nuclear power industry. A technology for the generation of electric power through nuclear plants. I just thought I would mention that. All right, so those are your basic players. Now the question is, so what? And does anyone have an answer to that? Why should anyone care?
Because everybody's interested in something.
Well, a lot of people do. But do you think that there'd be any implication in terms of news content in these companies based on their corporation profile? Could you be so cynical to think that? Here's an example. This was in the first week of the United States invasion of Afghanistan. I happened to be in Romania for a week. And I was glued to CNN International, basically CNN Europe. And what do you think the major story on CNN was that week? This is the week that the United States invaded Afghanistan. So what would be the logical conclusion for this? Wouldn't that be the lead story? It wasn't. The lead story was the first Harry Potter movie. Why? Why on earth would Harry Potter, the release of the Harry Potter film, be such an event on CNN? Follow the money. Warner Brothers. The studio licensing and releasing the first Harry Potter movie. Could there be a connection? Could they be so craven as to actually be ginning up the Harry Potter as a news story to effect maximum profits on a movie investment? The answer is yes. Another example. I'm sure that you, well maybe you're not. Are you all aware of the scandal last year with News Corp and the hacking in of people's cell phones? Tribunals, people getting fired, one major tabloid in England closing right down. Well, at the same time in the United States, two major papers were owned by Rupert Murdoch. One of them, a tabloid, the New York Post. Almost nothing in either the Post or the flagship venerable Wall Street Journal about these events. Finally, coverage in the Wall Street Journal was limited primarily to what the economic implications might be to News Corp. Nothing in the New York Post until the situation got so out of control they had to do something, and they ran editorials basically saying that Rupert Murdoch and News Corp were victims of a liberal conspiracy. So if you think that ownership of these huge corporations doesn't matter, you're wrong. Because in one way or another, ownership matters. And here's why. What is the primary function of a corporation? Can anyone tell me what the job of a corporation is? Is it selection A, to serve the public good? To make sure that this planet survives and is better for our children than it is for us? Selection B, to economically rape and pillage everything in sight and run away with the money? Or selection C, to maximize profits for those who have invested in the corporation, for the shareholders? Which one do you think it is? How many think A? Please raise your hand. So young and so cynical. How about B? Rape and pillage and make off with as much as you possibly can and screw everybody else. Okay. How about number C, letter C? Well, you're right for those for C. There is nothing inherently wrong with the concept of a corporation. Apologies to Lenin and Marx. A CEO of a corporation has an ethical and fiduciary. That's one of those words that only adults use. My father used to use the word fiduciary, and I thought it was kind of obscene. Fiduciary, it just sounded bad, and adults use words like fiduciary. So I'm going to use it because now I'm an adult. CEOs have a fiduciary responsibility to their stockholders to protect their investments. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially if you're an investor. And especially, for example, if you consider that many pension funds in the United States, many municipal pension funds, many credit unions, teacher retirement funds have investments in corporations on the stock exchange. So I'm not talking about some, evil empire here. I'm just saying basically in this economical system, the prime directive of a corporation is to make money for its stockholders. Well, that's not a problem until you have major corporations owning news outfits, where you have a different obligation. And one could argue, if you adhere to the social responsibility theory of media, that the purpose of CBS News is not to reap maximum profits for the shareholders of CBS, nor in terms of ABC for Walt Disney Corporation, or for NBC for General Electric, or for Fox News Corp. Rather, ideally, the function of these news outlets, and I haven't even started on newspapers yet, is to provide information for the citizenry of this country so that we can make informed decisions and participate effectively as citizens in a democracy. Well, which do you think wins out, folks? That ethical imperative to generate profits for shareholders, or the social responsibility mission of the news media? Because with the corporate conglomerate model, you have this inevitable conflict. Who wins? The corporations or the individual news organizations within those corporations? To some extent, the corporations. You say, well, why do you say that? And I'll give you a few facts which I think can explain it. If you take a look at foreign news bureaus among the major media companies in the United States over the last 15 years, what you will find is a reduction of about half of them. If you take a look at the staffs of newsrooms, newspapers, radio staffs, you will find a similar pattern. Because there's only two ways to generate revenues in commercial media. Through advertising. Well, it's basically one way. Through advertising. If you want to cut costs, you've got to basically do it by increasing advertising to increase revenues, or reduce your labor costs. You reduce your labor costs by closing down news bureaus, by laying off journalists, and squeezing the maximum that you can out of what's left. So what's left? What's left are news agencies spread so thin that international coverage is left to a few wire service agencies such as, and they're good wire service agencies, AP, Reuters, which means that most American consumers of international news pretty much are getting the same story from the same sources, because there's not enough investment in enough foreign coverage. Domestically, a lot of national bureaus are closed down. The nature of journalism starts changing in favor of quick reactive pieces as opposed to serious enterprise investigative journalism, which is very expensive. Bottom line pressures will meet deadline pressures in a corporate media system. It is inevitable. So even the best of them, New York Times, for example, which is a great newspaper, is continuing to experience cutting of staff. Some formerly great newspapers are in states of perpetual turmoil, like the Los Angeles Times, who has undergone major shifts in ownership. Declining ad revenues, declining news holes, their ability to cover that vast city are compromised because there just is not the budget allowed to fully staff these news organizations. So this is another problem that we have to look at. And I will bet you that you have similar problems here, because economics are international. How many of you are aware of pressures to cut news staffs, lay off people here in Latvia? Does this happen? No?
Of course, exactly.
Thank you. I'll bet it does. And it happens most likely for very similar reasons. We've got the bottom line, we have our shareholders, we have our owners who want a return on their investment, and we've got the deadline, and we've got the whole other part of the picture, which is what journalists ought to be doing in a free society. So it's a problem. It's a problem all the way around. The question is what to do about it. A lot of us, and I've lost this, but it really doesn't matter. A lot of us are very concerned about the impact of having 6 major corporations control most of the news media in the United States. And we're not even talking at this point about players like Google, about Facebook, because their influence and their impact in terms of mass media is still very much in flux and to be determined. I'm really focusing at this point on news media. But with so few corporations controlling so much of not only the news but of popular culture in our country, people ought to be concerned. I imagine you are acquainted with the concepts of vertical and horizontal integration. The Walt Disney Corporation is probably the most beautiful textbook case of vertical integration on the planet, where every constituent part of that corporation feeds another. In the case of Time Warner, which isn't Disney, but it's another example, their news division, CNN, certainly helped to prop up Warner Brothers Pictures and the release of Harry Potter. At the expense, I might add, of probably some incisive analysis about the beginning of the American war in Afghanistan. But money talks, or so do weapons. So we do have a problem with increasingly concentrated media ownership in a very large market. The last thing I want to just present to you is how this happened. How many of you think it just happened in the natural course of economic evolution? That, oh well, it was just because the laws of the marketplace naturally led to this decrease in, about 25 years from over 20 corporations to 6. Selection B. Somebody made it happen. How many think selection A? Natural law of evolution, which is what a lot of these corporations would have us believe. Selection B, somebody made it happen. All right, well, then the question is, who made it happen and why? We can start in 1987 with the repeal of what was called a fairness doctrine in American media, which was initiated in 1949. And it was to assure, first of all, that any media organization operating with a public license, and we're talking broadcast here now, was operating in the public good, however you wanted to define that. So the fairness doctrine said if you're going to have commentators of this political persuasion, then you need to balance it with the opposing political persuasion. Now in our country we only have 2, so it was pretty easy to figure that out. Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives. Well, that was overturned in the tail end of the second term of Ronald Reagan in 1987. Fairness doctrine thrown out. The Federal Communications Commission controls a lot of media law in the United States in terms of ownership and broadcast rights, because people were rightfully concerned about monopoly ownership. And I think for obvious reasons, monopoly ownership is a bad thing. If you want to relive what monopoly ownership is like, go back to the Soviet system, the press, where you essentially had a monopoly system. Well, we're getting very close to that in a very odd way in the United States, except that the control is not coming from government, but from corporate interests, from corporate conglomerates. In 1996, under the administration of Bill Clinton, a little-known law was passed called the Telecommunications Act, which went under the radar and had more impact on the media landscape than anything that has come before it or since. And I would be surprised if anybody in this room ever heard of this law, and the same could be said for if this were a room full of American students. You would know nothing about this law. What this law basically did is it effectively ended controls, meaningful controls, on how much of media any one organization could own, and more specifically in any one area. Before the Telecommunications Act, for example, was passed, Rupert Murdoch could not possibly have owned a television station and a newspaper in the same city. First thing that happened after the passage of the Telecommunications Act, Rupert Murdoch bought the New York Post. Rupert Murdoch was one of the people behind passage of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, as were every other major media player, including Time Warner, including General Electric, including CBS. All of this went under the radar. They spent tens of millions of dollars of lobbyists in Congress to make sure that this law was passed. This law also, by the way, gave away over $7 billion of broadband allocations, which are publicly controlled, to private corporations. In fact, to these same private corporations, including Comcast. The result of the Telecommunications Act was almost immediate. It created the media profile I presented to you today of 6 major players controlling the overwhelming majority of American television, radio, film, publishing, magazines, and music industry. I haven't even started talking about newspapers, but we can just save that for another time, except to say that we have the major player there is the Gannett Corporation with over 100 newspapers alone in the United States. But whatever the company that controls the major newspapers, they are essentially monopoly papers in their cities with the exception of New York. Big exception of New York. So the media ownership profile in America is the result of direct and rather quiet political action by a few corporations. The New York Times, after the bill was passed, simply referred to the Telecommunications Act of 1996 as the best legislation $40 million of lobbying could buy. And that is why we have gone from over 20 to 11 in 1996 to 6 now in terms of the major and most important media players in the American marketplace. Follow the money. This could not have happened without changes in federal media law that are mandated by the Congress. Congress, in effect, was bought. And the result of it now is the current media system we have in our country. So that's basically the way the game is played. Is that about what you expected? Is there anything new that I told you today? Anything at all?
Details were new.
I'm sorry?
The concept was not new, but the details were new.
Well, here's another detail, because details are fun, and we reporters like details. And I don't have an answer for this, but if you consider the vast holdings that the major news organizations in this country have in finance industries, and I'm including insurance and banking, that would also include private healthcare corporations, including private insurance companies, private hospitals. You have to wonder, could this have any implications for the way the news media covers issues of public health, including the huge debate going on in America now about assuring that all Americans have some kind of health insurance? Could it have anything to do with media coverage or lack thereof of the collapse of a lot of the banks and the bailouts in 1988? I'm sorry, 2008, 2009. When you consider the vast holdings that a few of these media companies have in defense industry contracts, do you think that it might have some implications for the way those very important issues are covered? It's a troubling question. But when you have such an inevitable conflict of interest, starting with the priority of the corporation to maximize profits for shareholders and the priority of the news agencies to serve the public good by providing intelligent, comprehensive news in context, we're set up for a really serious problem. This is not the only way to analyze the situation, and I'm sure you will find others who would put a much more benign spin on all of this, saying, oh no, it's very, very good, because these corporations have deep pockets and can help subsidize the news operations. Well, I've seen some of that too. I've seen it in Vermont with our major daily, which is called the Burlington Free Press, owned by Gannett. They own approximately 100 newspapers. And I have seen the Free Press, with all the billions that Gannett has at its disposal, shrink into a newspaper that would barely serve the needs of 4 parakeets if you used it to line a birdcage. So I'm very skeptical about the deep pockets of corporations and their abilities to improve media product. Generally what happens is it goes the other way. What's the answer? I wish I had one for you. Some people are talking about foundations starting to turn some of these large newspapers, for example, into not-for-profit corporations, much like National Public Radio has become in the constituent state public radios. There are models out there. There are ways to do it. But we haven't really discovered them yet. But I think I can say for sure that having 6 major corporations who have such vast international reach in so many areas is inevitably going to compromise the quality and scope of the news that the American people get. And that's not a good thing. So, thank you. I hope I haven't wasted your time. And I'd be happy for some questions. And I did, by the way, I was going to do a PowerPoint, and I just took pity on you. And I didn't do a PowerPoint, and I hope you're not disappointed that I didn't do a PowerPoint. I just couldn't bear to do that to you today. All right, questions. I'm a little rock and roll deaf, so speak up. Yes, sir.
May I ask a question about how important language barriers in distribution of activities of these media corporations, and what do you think about hypothesis that small language communities is more protected from the influence from these big corporations?
Depends on the language. Telemundo, I think the whole issue of language is so fascinating to me, and I haven't really thought a lot about it in terms of media dynamics, because the United States, on the surface, is still so, categorically English. But I know that if I go to Miami, I'm in a Spanish-speaking city, and I know that probably in 20 years, the American Southwest is going to be, that English is going to be, if not a minority language, almost. And there is a huge investment. For example, in General Electric, I believe, has Telemundo. So the Spanish language media is subject, I think, very much to the same pressures, and will be becoming increasingly so. There's not much French media in the United States, despite our proximity to Quebec, and Canada nominally is bilingual. My short answer, I guess, is that the Spanish language media is growing rapidly, and it is not going to be immune to any of those pressures. Other ones aren't really important players at this point.
Tyrone, could you explain a bit this part of public media in USA that you have been supported for many years by yourself?
I have a friend who visits me periodically from Moldova, and I go over there periodically. I've done a bunch of work in Moldova. And he has fallen in love with Vermont Public Radio. Nikolai is just completely in love with Vermont Public Radio. Now, American radio is very interesting. It's extremely profitable. And you may wonder, why are all these corporations investing in all of this media? Well, the answer is not because they want to advance the public good. The answer is because there's still a lot of money to be made in it. And radio, which no one really talks about a lot, is hugely profitable in the United States. And there are 2 basic universes of radio. There's public radio and commercial radio. Public radio is not as it quite sounds. Originally, National Public Broadcasting System was designed by the Lyndon Johnson administration, conceived then as a hedge against growing media monopoly, corporate media monopoly. And it was going to be funded substantially through tax dollars. The federal government would subsidize state public radio stations and would subsidize the national public broadcasting, which all of these exist today. But what's happened over the years is the political will to fund this has diminished in the face, I think, a lot of propaganda campaigns by conservatives that public radio is too liberal, it does not reflect an equal and fair and balanced point of view. And anyone who thinks that Fox News is fair and balanced needs to listen to Fox News a little more closely. It certainly isn't. The point is that over the years, the funding for public radio, public funding, has decreased so that it's public in name only. It's public now in a different way. I would say maybe 25% at max of the operating expenses of public broadcasting is coming from public funds, from tax dollars. The remaining, the overwhelming majority of those funds now come from donors like me, listeners, and from corporate underwriting, as opposed to corporate commercials. It's a distinction, fine one, but a distinction. For example, Vermont Public Radio is on 24 hours a day. It does some of the best journalism I've ever seen. It is an amazingly important asset to the health, civic health of our state. They do fundraisers every 3 months, 4 months, there are 3 of them a year, where they raise hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think almost $1 million is what they need to raise in a state that's this small, just to maintain their operations and to pay their staff. They get most of their money from people like me, who pay $10 a month. Now, I could listen to it and never pay a cent, and they make that point. But a lot of people just say, okay, this is worth it to me. And they pay $10 a month or $120 a year to support public radio. In that sense, it's truly now public. And this is an economic model that some newspapers, especially a few online newspapers, are trying to play with, as opposed to just relying on advertising. And this is really no different than how the media started in our country, and maybe how it started here, where newspapers existed through subscribers. Well, it's the same thing with public broadcasting now. They're depending more and more upon viewer and listener subscriptions to fund their operations. So the marketplace in that way is talking. It's a very different kind of radio. It's more serious. The journalism on Vermont Public Radio, for example, and in the the McNear Hour evening news on national public radio and national public television, are really a good, solid journalism. I think better than what you find in the commercial networks. But it comes at a price, and that price often is that the consumers pay directly for it voluntarily, as well as corporations underwriting. And these can be not-for-profit corporations, they can be oil companies, they can be anything. Their overt messages are not part of what you're seeing, however. As to why they would invest money to underwrite public broadcasting is another matter. Some of it is simply, it's really good public relations, especially the oil companies, and they need it. Does that help?
Yes, but you should ask them, because I'm afraid to ask, who of them are ready to pay at least $10 for a good journalism? Please ask them.
Would you pay $1 a month?
Oh, they are rich people.
You're already paying more than that for bad journalism. Every time you pick up a newspaper, you're paying.
But they don't pick any newspaper.
How many of you read newspapers? Anna, you're breaking my heart. Let me leave with some illusions, please.
Okay.
How many of you...
But you already broken all illusions about US media. So...
How many people in this room read newspapers? See?
No.
Bless your hearts. Now let's do this again. Honestly, how many people in this room read newspapers?
Okay.
I hope that you can discuss this with your students. I'm astonished. I think that's really great. The New York Times is so desperate for a new generation of readers that they're pushing their newspaper like drug dealers. This is what they're doing, and it's brilliant. In our campus, and this is a college with 15 or 16 bachelor degree programs and 7 master's degrees programs. It's a small institution, part of a larger state institution, but we have about 2,000 people on our campus. Every morning at 10 o'clock, by some divine miracle, the New York Times appears in 12 news racks around the campus for free. And students actually pick them up. By noon, they're gone. And one of the things that I'm finding, because I ask people all the time about this, is the students are actually reading the New York Times, and to their amazement, they like reading the New York Times. Whether it'll stick or not once they have to buy it is another matter. But if I'm going to buy the Burlington Free Press, which I don't know the word for excrement in Latvian, but human excrement, or bovine excrement, but you can imagine, you can fill in the blanks. That's basically what the Burlington Free Press is at this point. A lot of the other newspapers in Vermont I will pay 75 cents for, because that's what they cost, and they're very good. But I'll buy the Free Press anyway, because not having it is worse than having it as bad as it is. So if I can spend 75 cents buying the Free Press once, and how many times in a month would I buy it or any other newspaper? It seems to me I could spend $10 a month on something I listen to every day, and I listen to it a lot, especially if I'm in the car. I wake up to it. They start at 5 o'clock in the morning with their broadcasts. All night they add BBC World Service. So it's a great way to get a picture of what's going on in the world for $10 a month. Looking at discrepancies in incomes and everything else, though I don't think it's 10 times less here by any means, because the prices are the same, so I'm always amazed at that. I think if you had the chance, you would probably contribute a little bit, anyway a little bit, to a not-for-profit media organization to give you media that you really wanted. And the idea that people don't want good journalism, they don't care about it, is a lie. Because if you give people good journalism, they're going to take it, and they're going to want more of it. And I'm going to say the same thing to you folks that I say to my students, which is, go out there and spread beauty and light. Because who else is going to do it? Learn how the game is played, and then figure out how to change it for the better. The message that I would like to leave you with is, you could make a difference. If you try, you might fail a number of times, but you'll also succeed sometimes. And the future of the media, whatever it is in this country, I'm looking at it right here in this room. And it's going to be up to you. And good luck. But if you don't try, you will never succeed. So go out there and make a difference and figure out how to make it better. And don't be afraid of print media. It's not going to disappear either. Other questions? Yes?
I'm working right now on a final paper, and it's about culture media. In your opinion, I'm just wondering, do you think is it worth, or does the government need to support those cultural media, the music, magazines, and stuff? Is it important to support those?
I love cultural media. Whether the government should support it or not, in a perfect world, we have something called the National Endowment for the Arts in America. We also, in Vermont, have the Vermont Council of the Arts. And these are not-for-profit organizations that directly support the arts. But I'm not aware of them directly supporting publications about the arts. It would be nice if they did. I'm just happy enough that there's any support coming from the public sphere on art at all. A friend of mine in Romania, during the Ceausescu time, had this publication called Tribuna in Cluj. And it was completely funded by the government. Completely. They never had to worry at all about financial matters. And if you know anything about Transylvania, you know that there's this kind of inherent ethnic conflict or tension between the Hungarian majority And the Romanians, although Transylvania is part of Romania. So after the revolution, the so-called revolution of 1989, he's still editor of Tribuna, or he was, but the problem is the funding completely dried up. And now he was in the position where he could publish anything he wanted, and he couldn't afford to. When I asked him in 1995, I was over there on research, I said, what's the difference now between working under Ceausescu as an editor and now? And he said this, it's completely different. He said, it's absolutely different. This is what it was like before. Our hands were shackled behind our backs. We couldn't print what we wanted. There was plenty of money, but we couldn't print. He said, it's completely different now. Now it's like this. Our hands are still shackled. We can print everything we want, but there's no money. What's the difference? It would be nice if after the revolution the government continued to fund Tribuna, but it didn't. Tribuna died. Questions? Yes, sir?
How do you see, is there a relationship between the big politics in the United States and the big media owners and the news media content? Is there influence from big politics? Because you also thought about the media law in 1996. Media owners, it's important for them to have good relationships between the corporate media is free to cover important political issues, both external and internal, how they want to cover them, or is there some influence from the politics?
That's a lovely question. And I wish I could give you a lovely answer. This is so complicated. Just as a case in point, in the march to war in 2003, where Bush prepared a case to go to war in Iraq, the pretext that he used was weapons of mass destruction. And that if Saddam Hussein didn't surrender those weapons, we were going to go in there and invade. And he made a speech at the United Nations, a very famous speech. The only problem with it is it was all lies. The American media, you would expect, would say, now wait a minute. Show us your evidence. Well, he showed evidence, but the evidence was really flimsy. And the problem was, there were no weapons of mass destruction, as everyone in this room knows now. Why did the media not exercise due diligence and appropriate skepticism? And had they, perhaps, they might have been able to turn American opinion against the war before it started. Now, whether this was the result of direct interference, it's hard to say. A lot of the broadcasters of the major media admitted afterwards that there was huge pressure on them to basically agree with the State Department and Pentagon line that there were weapons of mass destruction and it was justified and necessary to go in. There was no overt, police pressure. But what a lot of media outlets feared was a public backlash, this is my belief anyway, for being perceived as unpatriotic, of losing ratings, in a sense. So I think that there is often political pressure, but it comes in very different ways. Another way that it comes, in some cases it comes economically, and one very quick example of this was Richard Nixon, back in 1972, who, as you know, resigned in disgrace 2 years later. In his re-election, almost every major newspaper in the United States endorsed him. Endorsed him. The question is, why? When their editorials for years ran against everything he was trying to do. The answer is very simple. Richard Nixon allowed passage of a law, a little-known law called the Newspaper Preservation Act, which allowed newspapers to form monopolies. In other words, for one newspaper in a city to buy out a competitor and ostensibly operate as a joint operating venture. But in reality, one of them consumed the other. This was extremely popular among the major newspapers in the United States. Nixon facilitated passage of that, and as a result got very, very kind treatment. Tony Blair, as you know, was endorsed when he ran against John Major for Prime Minister. I guess it wasn't quite running, but was endorsed as Prime Minister by Rupert Murdoch, who is a conservative. Why? The answer was the conservatives in the House of Parliament, the Tories at that point, were considering media legislation that was in conflict with what Rupert Murdoch wanted. He had a private understanding with Tony Blair that if Blair became Prime Minister, he would not interfere, he would not pursue those plans. In other words, he would create a climate more favorable for Rupert Murdoch, which is exactly what he did. So there is definitely, on some levels, a dance. In the United States, it's a little harder to make that case because political parties, for instance, receive donations. Almost, I mean, all corporations cover their bets. They're going to donate to Democrat candidates and they're going to donate to Republican candidates just to cover their own butts. But, so in the sense I think you mean it, my answer would be no, there's not that kind of pressure. But political pressure can be exerted in other ways as well. One of which is access for reporters. If you're a political journalist on the national stage, you are only as good as your access to sources. I mean, this is understandable. The problem is that we have a closed loop of sources. They're the usual suspects, and they're either people currently in power, people recently out of power having legacies to defend, or people in academic, quasi-academic think tanks who were formerly in power and now are in these think tanks that are usually owned by corporations and ownership is not always transparent. So your sources are all going to be pretty much speaking from very similar perspectives. And you need access. You need access to these people, and they'll stop answering your calls if you write stuff that's just too unfavorable to them. They'll simply stop cooperating with you. So there is going to be some pressure somewhere to moderate whatever it is you're doing, not to alienate your sources. I think this is just a fact of life. So how you treat your sources is going to have an influence. And I'm talking about on the ground level of the reporters now. But there have been notorious cases. Ben Bradley, when he was the publisher of the Washington Post, was very good friends with John F. Kennedy. And knew about the incoming Bay of Pigs invasion, which was one of the worst fiascos in the United States history. One of the dumbest things we've ever done. And in hindsight, Kennedy said to Bradley, I wish the newspapers had done something with this before it happened. Because then probably it wouldn't have happened, because it turned out to be a terrible mistake. Did Ben Bradley serve the American interests by keeping that story secret for 4 days before the invasion, the aborted invasion? The answer in hindsight is no. So it really depends, but there is definitely, I think, an unhealthy relationship between corporate money and politicians, without a doubt. And it's systemic. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 is a perfect example of this. That is totally the result of corporate lobbyists climbing in bed with congressional representatives and senators to create legislation favorable to them. It's unfortunate. Money talks. These corporations are hugely wealthy. And if anyone thinks that they don't contribute substantially to political campaigns, they're naive. They do. And they do because they expect something in return. Does that help answer that question?
Yes, but I think maybe there's some examples when the influence is much more ugly, even more direct because I remember there was a Hollywood film based on true story about Iraq War, about a journalist who wanted to expose lies about those chemical weapons. He knew that there were no such weapons, and he wanted to expose those lies. But there started a campaign even against him from the government. He lost his job, and so I don't remember all in details, but there was a Hollywood film some 2 years ago based on true story.
I'm not surprised. But the pressure came indirectly from government sources to corporate owners, to the editors, then to the reporter. There are a number of cases, for example, and there's one in NBC that then spilled over to CBS, where a very reputable independent documentary film crew documented some amazing slaughter in the desert. This was in the Gulf War. Amazing slaughter of just a part of war. But what they showed was a battalion of Iraqi soldiers literally being cut in half by American gunships as they were attempting to escape a bunker. And what they were trying to do, as any war journalist should be doing, is bearing witness to slaughter, no matter who it is. Well, ABC refused to air it. The company went to CBS, and CBS said they would air it. And 2 hours before, and my facts, it's been a while since I've studied this one, 2 hours before broadcast, the producer was fired and the broadcast was canceled. The pressure came ultimately from the Pentagon. As to what leverage is another matter. I don't know. I know that those kind of pressures exist. I know that if you have credentials and access to a theater of war, and things have changed with the embedding, which is a whole other way of controlling journalists in the theater of battle. In the first Iraq War, very few journalists were allowed in. If you reported negatively, your credentials were yanked and you were sent home. There are some cases where the American public never find out about things, and I'm referring to the so-called invasion of Panama. I mean, this is ancient history now, under George H.W. Bush, when they went in to take Noriega out. There was a complete news embargo on this. Absolutely nothing. What press were in Panama were locked inside a hotel until the military operation was over. What was never reported were 5,000 civilian casualties in a period of 24 hours. 5,000 civilian casualties and 20,000 homeless. It was years before the media even felt compelled to tell this story. I'm talking about the corporate media.
Speaking about those mass destruction weapons, I have heard another version, and a documentary film was even shown on the Latvian TV, made by French journalists, and they stressed that there were mass destruction weapons, but they were delivered by the Western companies, and therefore the final information was that no, there were no mass destruction weapons, because if people had said that yes, they were, then the next step would be then they must recognize that those weapons were delivered by the Western companies.
Well, part of that is true, and I think part of it is. In terms of weapons of mass destruction, it was clear the United States was arming Saddam Hussein for years, because the enemy of our enemy is our friend, right? And our enemy at the time was Iran, and Saddam Hussein was our good friend. So we were arming him to the teeth. But I don't believe that we were arming him with chemical weapons, nor we didn't need to. They could make their own. Nor were we arming him with nukes. We were, however, at a certain point, providing him with the technology for developing nuclear power rather than nuclear weapons. So I would leave it at that extent. But you know, we all look at the Taliban now. The United States created the Taliban. Do you all realize that? I mean, we basically created the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. And so there is some karma in this world for sure, isn't there? You should have paid more attention.
I mean, I'm sorry, I mean not only the US, but as I understood, they were talked about also French companies, for instance, German companies, speaking about those mass destruction weapons.
How would you describe weapons of mass destruction?
Chemistry. Raw materials to make further chemical materials.
I'll bet you every nation on this planet has those. I think that what we were after for weapons of mass destruction, we were really talking about news with Iran. Because almost anyone has the potential to create chemical weapons. To just go on the internet. So, yeah, I mean, we're all guilty. None of us have clean hands in any of this.
So I also had questions about the relationship between politics and media. And I crystallized three aspects or three concrete questions. First is about how could you actually describe how to understand the situation around Bin Laden's death in last year? And in this connection also, what is the role in this picture that now the civic journalism and social media are playing? Because sometimes news appear first in social media and social networks. And the last question, very concretely, how can you describe the difference between media politics of both parties?
Let me take it in reverse order. Both parties support essentially the existing corporate capitalist system. There's no alternative to that. There's no alternative in the political spectrum that has any meaning or velocity or power. The Democrats are more in favor of more social support, closer to the social democracy model of Western Europe. The Republicans generally are more in favor, and increasingly so, of cutting the role of government drastically, cutting support of public programs drastically. Only, I think, in the last few years has a really significant difference started to emerge between the two parties. As far as who's supporting them, that question is complicated by new laws passed by the Supreme Court. Specifically, I'm referring to Citizens United, which allows for the creation of these super PACs whose membership is not transparent and who can contribute huge amounts of money to media campaigns. In general, the super PACs, the Republicans have more money from super PACs than the Democrats do. All of that said, right now, Obama has more money in his campaign chest for the next election than any of the Republicans combined. So he certainly is going to have support from the corporations as well. I think it's a bit of both. As far as the second question, I don't know. The information on Bin Laden was so controlled that there was no option for social media to get ahead of that story. Often where I think social media plays its greatest role in covering events is where traditional media is either asleep at the wheel or haven't gotten there yet. And I'm referring to the original eruptions in Tahrir Square, where social media, in fact, drove the early coverage of the Arab Spring. Okay. Well, nice meeting you all.
Thank you for coming and see you next time when Tyrone's coming.
I hope to see you all again, and thank you for putting up with me.
This evening at the
Yes.
Yeah, everybody.